Okay, so let's dive straight into it. By way of introduction, my name is Ujwal. I'm a cultural anthropologist and the co-founder and CEO of MotivBase. I have my co-founder and our president, Jason Partridge, on the line as well. He will moderate Q&A for us. And Jason and I wrote a book called Microcultures, which was published in February of this year. I would urge you to check that out because it is now is an extremely relevant time to consider the concept of microcultures, because it gives us perspective on getting ourselves out of the short-term thinking, which is so easy to do, especially in a time like this, to actually start to think about the long-term impacts of this pandemic on our businesses and how we can start to ensure that our pipeline, our innovation pipeline, doesn't suddenly go empty or suddenly get sort of out of date, if you will. So that's really going to be our focus today. For those of you who don't know us, by way of introduction, we run a company called MotivBase. MotivBase is a 4.5-year-old company. We work with 130 plus organizations across the globe, and our job is really to help these organizations decode culture. And specifically what I mean by that is to decode the hidden meanings or the subtext behind what people talk about, so that we can understand a pure consumer-led perspective of the things that matter: trends, issues, topics, ideas, the things that all of us care about through the consumer lens, because they all impact our businesses. What our technology allows us to do is to perform an observational ethnographic analysis on demand with agility, so that we can understand the subtext, the hidden meanings, the underlying intrinsic motivations, and then more importantly, quantify those so that we can determine where culture sits in its maturity, how many people it's relevant to, is there growth, is there volatility? All these kinds of questions is what we're very, very good at answering. We're all anthropologists, and our job is really to apply deep anthropological models onto AI and big data to enable this. And of course, that's exactly the technology that we have leveraged here. By way of introduction, I do want to give you a super quick reminder of how we're getting to some of these early signals, because it is critical. I'm just going to scribble here to give you a sense of how this happens. If you think about the conversations that we're having around COVID-19, think of this as your central node here. Well, and I'll draw a little circle here. Let's call this our inner circle. All of these other nodes are the most dominant meanings that we as people assign to COVID-19. And these meanings get assigned inadvertently, naturally, just through the conversations we have with one another about the pandemic day in, day out. And of course, as you can imagine, the dominant signals, the dominant inner circle meanings are all the obvious things, right? Symptoms and health guidelines, and what the president is doing or not doing, and so on and so forth, right? Should we wear masks? Shouldn't we wear masks? All of the stuff that's obvious is the stuff that sits in the inner circle. Now, the problem is that that's noise for us, because our interest isn't in trying to understand the short-term changes. There are many other research firms that do that way better than we do. Our interest is to understand how this pandemic, which is nothing but a massive cultural event, I'm going to call it that, this massive cultural event, which has come out of nowhere, is now impacting and affecting our beliefs, and is potentially changing the way we think about certain things or certain parts of our lives in the future. So our focus is really on understanding the longer term impacts that this pandemic could be having. Of course, culture is slow moving, right? Even in events like these where culture gets accelerated, change gets accelerated, it's still, an acceleration in the grand scheme of things, fairly gradual. First and foremost, you're not going to see industries completely get turned on their heads. Obviously, I'm taking out some of the economic barriers that will result from this pandemic out of the equation here, because we're talking about culture and we're talking about people's beliefs and people's motivations. But fundamentally, what you're going to see is certain parts of culture and certain parts of culture that affect certain industries or certain categories that we all play in. Those parts will get affected more so than others. And our job is to really identify those early signals. So what we're really doing is focused on trying to understand how these early signals get developed and how they grow. So for example, You might see a conversation about COVID-19 that extends to, let's say, immunity, and you might see a conversation about immunity extend into a conversation about, let's say, nutrition. And now suddenly we've got a conversation about nutrition that is indirectly related to COVID-19, but nonetheless, it has entered into the contextual frame of COVID-19 and it's starting to get impacted by the pandemic. So the more COVID-19 grows, the more the discussion in nutrition grows. The same thing, for example, is happening around concept of skin allergies. I'll come to that. Same thing is happening, let's say, on some of the changes with baby products. We'll get to that, and so on and so forth. So that's really what we're doing with our technology, is identifying the broader contextual boundary, identifying new signals that are entering that contextual boundary and that are maintaining consistent growth so that we can identify them and, of course, understand what they mean to consumers. And that gives us a sense and an idea of what some of those impending changes might be. Now, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box, and Jason will moderate them as necessary. Now, today's content is not going to take the full hour. We never present for the full hour. We know the human attention span is 20-25 minutes tops. So that's my goal. We'll try to end in the next 20 to 25 minutes in terms of the content, and then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A and conversation if need be, and even give you all some time back. Okay, so here's our agenda today. We're gonna cover the impact. So we're gonna cover the broader early signals of long-term change on 7 key industries, 7 key areas. We did not predetermine what these areas were. We let the consumer tell us. So we kind of followed the breadcrumbs of the consumer, going hop away and another hop away and another hop away, trying to figure out what those signals were and which industries they were naturally connecting to. So again, we did not decide which 7 these were going to be. We let the consumer decide that for us. But these are the 7 that are coming into focus, into early focus. And we thought that would be very fascinating. There is an 8th one, which is technology more broadly, but we decided not to cover that today, because our audience is not the audience that is worried about mobile technology and video conferencing technology and so on. And secondly, because that's a whole other rabbit hole in and of itself, and we decided to eliminate that. So just as a sidebar there. So we're going to focus on these 7 early signals of long-term change. Let's start with insurance. So we're going to go sector by sector here. Insurance, obviously I added, the sort of slash health there, because obviously in the context of insurance, health insurance is very much the central point of focus right now, the central node, if you will. There's some interesting things going on. And again, just as a reminder, I'm not going to talk to you about anything that is short-term and obvious. That's not what's of focus to us, because we could do, an hour-long presentation just on insurance if I include all the obvious short-term stuff. We're focused on the long-term signals, right? So early long-term signals. Okay, so first frame of early long-term signal around health insurance revolves around a couple of interesting areas. One is this notion of catastrophic coverage. You can see how this event has made people aware that A, that there's this thing called catastrophic coverage, and B, that they need to educate themselves on that depending on what plans they're on and what plans their employers may have put them on, and so on and so forth, and to do or take the steps necessary to protect themselves in the event that the catastrophic coverage is needed. So you're seeing a lot of discussion and a lot of debate and Q&A about what this thing is and what I should do specifically in my circumstance. An important communications opportunity, obviously, as for insurance companies here, in terms of the existing customer base. Another interesting area of long-term shift is in the area of genetic testing. Very fascinating, because the consumer's interest in genetic testing is growing because of this pandemic, with the idea, with an eye out to the future. How do I prepare myself better? How do I understand my own overall health and my family's predispositions so that I can be better prepared and I potentially can reduce some of the anxiety I currently feel in the future. So just really interesting, much greater openness to this concept of genetic testing. And obviously there's interest in wanting their insurance providers to cover them, to cover the costs, and maybe even help consumers find the right avenues for that. So preemptive genetic testing, very interesting. Another important area which relates to the preemptive genetic testing is also the area of preventative care. You're seeing people worried a lot about preventative care. And again, the focus here is on minimizing disruptions to preventative care, whatever that might be, whether it's regular checkups at the doctor, whatever else, because immunity and our overall health has come into such great focus right now. In this pandemic, people have become so much more aware of the preventative measures that they can take in order to protect themselves, not just right now, but more so with an eye towards the future. And I think that's the important thing to remember here. Some of the early signals are really showing us how people are, there's kind of this assumption now that this may not be the last one that we experience as a human race. And so maybe we need to start taking some of these things around preventative health and genetic testing and some of these areas more seriously, where in the past we may have dismissed them. So two important key areas that we thought were really, really fascinating, highly relevant to the insurance sector, where the relationship is growing. People's increased interest is driven out of whatever they're experiencing in the midst of this pandemic. Okay, next we're going to go on to a related topic, which is personal finance. Another interesting sector where we're seeing some early signals of long-term change. The first one, and we think this is really, really fascinating because we know, I mean, we have a lot of clients in the finance sector. We know the struggle with getting people to save, especially young people. But this is really fascinating because suddenly there's this whole narrative around how the cancellations of everything is suddenly allowing people to save hundreds, if not thousands of dollars each month for those people who are obviously lucky enough to have sustained employment during this time period. And so because of the savings now, suddenly it's opening the door to rethink and refocus on the notion of saving and planning for the future, especially younger consumers who are now experiencing this reality and realizing how important that notion of saving really might be, because they feel, less in control over their own career, their own jobs. And so we're definitely seeing that, an increased focus on saving. As a financial institution that's interested in getting people to save more, this is actually a really important time to be engaging with those consumers on some strategic initiatives around that, because you're seeing especially the younger consumer. So I'm talking about especially 25 to 44, that age group, you're seeing an increased awareness there. And it's all being driven out of this notion that, hey, discretionary expenses are down. I need to rethink my strategy. I see a bunch of questions coming in. Jason, I'm going to let you decide whether to interrupt me or take them in the end. Meanwhile, I'm just going to keep going.
Keep going.
Perfect. Another interesting concern that really dominated, again, a long-term signal, right? This is, again, driven out of obviously short-term realities, but it's suddenly dawning on a lot of people, especially people who feel they have dependents that rely on them, dependents that are on fixed incomes, that are retired, that may be aging. So aging parents, grandparents, but mostly revolves around aging parents where children feel responsible. And suddenly that sense of responsibility, the stress of that responsibility has suddenly come into focus because of this pandemic. Obviously people feel stuck, especially if they themselves lose their job or they themselves have income that is in and out during this time. And of course, dependents might be sick, they might not be able to help them. So there's a lot of anxiety driven around this, and it's going to drive a longer term focus on the things people can do to support their aging dependents. Again, there's some interesting opportunities here. There's obviously a parallel with the insurance sector here as well, as is with personal finance. But two very important early signals of long-term change. One, this renewed openness among younger consumers to saving and to thinking about saving for a rainy day. And then the second one is finding smarter ways to prepare for dependent aging parents. Okay, the third sector I'm going to talk about is cleaning. And by the way, this includes laundry, because obviously when we talk about cleaning products for the consumer, it includes everything from household cleaning products through to laundry detergents and dishwasher pellets and everything in between. So again, long-term signals of change. The first one, renewed interest in this notion of skin irritations and damage to the skin's natural flora. And again, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a scientist that chemical scientist or a scientist that understands some of these reactions. So I don't know, and I'm sure some of you may either nod or scratch your heads going, what is wrong with the consumer? But whatever it is, the point is that this is what's driving increased interest in the mind of the consumer. And part of this is driven by the short-term reactions that they're experiencing because of excessive hand washing or because of excessive use of disinfectants, both in terms of cleaning products and in terms of things like hand sanitizers and so on. So it's just really interesting here where this focus on skin irritation and damage to the skin's natural flora has come front and center. Again, this is not a new trend for those of you who have been tracking this. Obviously, this is not new, but what the pandemic is doing is it's renewing the interest in this, and it's showing us that there's a longer term signal here of a much greater interest and much more mainstream interest in topics like these, where they want to minimize the impacts of chemicals, soaps, disinfectants on the skin in reducing irritations, eczema, and series of other problems that consumers complain about. The discussions about natural flora are still early, but the simple fact that they're coming up is shocking in and of itself. The fact that it's coming up so close to the central node is very interesting to us, because those kinds of topics tend to be quite niche, at least tend to be quite niche in the past. And they're really being related to topics like dangerous chemicals, where their definition or the qualifier of dangerous is added because the consumer believes that it's dangerous for the skin. Now, the other part that you'll also notice here that's really interesting, that comes right here, is you'll see a lot of discussions about environmental allergens and harsh chemicals. And it's really interesting because outside of skin damage or so-called skin damage, the consumer is also really now interested in topics like chronic inflammation and allergies. So there's a renewed interest and focus on how cleaning products can cause allergies, oftentimes cause allergies or cause stress on our respiratory tracts in a way that we might not realize on a day-to-day basis. So we might be using a lot of these products without even realizing that they're causing the damage that they might be causing. And that's really fascinating. Again, another long-term signal change, where people discuss things like respiratory stress, people discuss things like impact of harsh chemicals on increasing our allergies or increasing our reactions to allergies, especially during allergy season. So there's a strong linkage to seasonal allergies and people who suffer from that, but there's also a strong linkage just to the notion of inflammation and respiratory distress. Obviously, again, because the pandemic has renewed interest in our understanding of what causes respiratory distress, or what allows our systems to function at its optimal. Again, long-term signal, but growing. Also not a new trend. People have known and have this is a conversation that has existed. It's been niche. There's a renewed interest in increased connection. And I included the term includes laundry in the headline just to clarify this, because we can see people talking about this in the context of everything from the detergents they use through to the products they use to clean their kitchen counters and surfaces and so on and so forth. Okay, so the next, and this is our fourth category, I believe, is baby. Another really interesting category where we're seeing some indications of long-term shift, long-term change. And by the way, you will notice, and the reason why this is interesting, even looking at the impact of categories that have nothing to do with your business, the reason why it's interesting is you'll notice there's a consistent pattern here. And I won't say what that is. We'll come back to that in our closing notes, but you'll start to see some consistent patterns, all driven by our heightened sense of awareness around certain parts of our health. In baby, there's another really interesting thing. Look, this concept of baby-led is not new. It has existed, but it has existed in a niche way. Everything from baby-led weaning to letting the baby lead across the different stages of development. How do you figure out what next steps you should do, whether it's toilet training or weaning the baby off of breast milk onto solids, and so on and so forth. Every single step along that journey, there's a whole philosophy, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, that is baby-led. That has been niche for a long time. It's coming into focus now, suddenly, and it's coming into focus along with a bunch of other things. For example, an increased, renewed interest in reusable diapers and reducing the environmental impact of some of the products that consumers use around baby. It's also renewed an interest in topics or discussions around things like elimination communication, skin-to-skin contact, a lot of topics that generally have kind of sat on with niche audiences, early adopters, innovators in this space, not with the mainstream, is coming into increased focus and is getting renewed energy because of this pandemic. And overall, what this is doing is it's creating an interest in a more quote unquote natural approach to baby care. And that is emerging here out of this pandemic, which is just really a fascinating change. And of course, it's accompanied with a renewed interest and focus on and the fear of allergies. Again, you'll see that consistent thread here on allergies. We talked about that with cleaning. Now you're seeing that with baby, this heightened awareness of how children may develop allergies, children may have allergies. The parents may not necessarily even understand what's causing them until they get very severe. And the focus is now becoming on finding natural means to minimize allergies, to identify them early enough, and in particular, use natural means because the parent believes that that's a way to ensure that at least they're not inadvertently causing new types of allergies to the child by using certain types of products that may be freely available or part of the mainstream. So again, obviously this has impacts on everything from, natural rash creams and diaper creams through to, the consumption of dairy and certain types of foods and so on and so forth, depending on obviously the age of the child. But, foundationally, overall shift and increased focus on the natural side of baby care, and then on minimizing allergies and perceived allergies has, again, renewed interest, renewed focus, long-term shift. We're going to continue to see this.
Which is a great segue to a question, Ujwal, which is, do we see this focus on cleaning as a more specific version or subtopic of the previous webinar topic where we discussed the changing culture of immune health and immunity health? Yeah. Or do we see this as a new topic that really kind of wasn't really presenting itself previously? How do we compare these new topics against that original work that was done a month ago?
Yeah, so in essence, there are a couple of things that have happened. The original work that we did a month ago, I forget now, but I believe it had data up to the end of February. And so back then, within the contextual boundary, we couldn't really see a clear linkage that the consumer was making. And I say clear, I mean, we were seeing some early signs, but not enough data to be able to present it to you in a confident manner. Where it was being linked back to specific types of industries. So for example, we saw, broad themes emerge like immune health. I have it in front of me here, immune health or corporate responsibility or mass production and sourcing, air quality. Now we've looked at data right up to end of day yesterday. So that's April 15th. So that's another month and a half of data that we've added. And that additional month and a half has brought in so much more richness because now we're seeing it's basically like anything in culture. As people gain more knowledge about something, they start to relate it back more and more to the different steps and the parts of their lives that they can relate it to. And that's what's happening. So now think about it this way, the 6 themes we took you through last time, we've basically double clicked one layer deeper now. And all these 6 themes are driving towards some specific applications to some specific industries. And that's what really we're taking you through now. So all of those previous 6 themes, by the way, we've validated, they all still apply. They all consistently carried through into right up to yesterday, the 15th of April. What we've been able to do now is get renewed data that allows us to dive one layer deeper. Okay, so next category is beauty. And by the way, again, we're following the definitions of the consumer. So this includes, for those of you who are curious, includes skincare, makeup, hair care, and some other peripheral categories. The consumer may not distinguish it in certain ways. Again, broader beauty, similar pattern like you saw with baby. There's a move towards cleaner beauty and simpler beauty. Suddenly, again, these are not brand new trends. It's just renewed interest, renewed focus. Clean beauty was always a trend. There's a lot of our clients that are already pursuing and had a lot of success in this area. So again, not anything new, but the interesting thing is that it's just renewed the focus on clean beauty, especially amongst mainstream consumers who are really viewing it as increased transparency around the safety of ingredients that do not harm their health, that are less toxic. And in particular, essential oils and DIY solutions come into play a lot. This is something interesting where the consumer believes that essential oils, in particular, obviously, we believe essential oils comes up because it's an easy thing for people to understand and wrap their heads around when they think about DIY skincare. But I think the broader idea of what are the things I could do where I could DIY something, I could take a set of ingredients and I could do the things that simplify my skincare practices. That's really what's interesting about this. And the simplicity is something that the consumer is suddenly realizing is helping them. It's partly because obviously people don't have to go to work and they might be simplifying their regimens, and that's obviously opening the door to certain aspects or certain experiments that they may have been hesitant to do in the past that they're now doing. But you see a lot of topics or discussions where you can see people realizing that they're getting compliments from their friends on video calls saying your skin's glowing, you're looking good, and there's an increased realization that, oh, maybe some of these quote unquote natural products, and I put quotes there because we're all in the industry here, and obviously there's no technical definition to that, but there's this increased reliance on that because there's a feeling that the simplicity is actually helping my skin's health. That's why I circle topics like skin health, because it's just coming into renewed interest and focus. It's becoming less about how I look and more about the health behind it. How do I make my skin healthier rather than how do I make my skin look good, which is what the narrative has traditionally been. So it's just interesting to see that. And then sure enough, the focus on allergies, also pervasive in the beauty space. Consumers increasingly sensitive to products that they feel are resulting in rashes, irritations. It's also really interesting because people are starting to simplify their regimens. They're feeling like they're suddenly realizing that certain things were actually causing harm, but they never realized it in the past. So again, it's just driving an increased interest in cleaner beauty. And there's definitely an increased interest also in allergy tests and diagnosis methods. So that's another area that we're seeing starting to open up. And of course, we'll track this again in another month. But it's just interesting, again, these kinds of tests have existed, but I wouldn't be surprised if we suddenly start to see more and more technologies in this area crop up that allow people to DIY and get DIY results at home. And then the last area that's really interesting is with hair. I was joking with Jason that, I got my COVID haircut. I just took a machine and went boom. Meanwhile, with women, we're actually seeing a renewed interest in longer hair and a renewed interest in hair health because there's time to kind of sit back and take notice. So we're seeing a renewed interest in both topicals and ingestibles when it comes to hair and scalp health specifically. So obviously everything from taking vitamins to the things you can apply. It's opening the door to potentially newer rituals, newer regimens. We'll have to wait and see. I say potentially new because we're seeing some early signs of that. But the important sign that we are seeing is this renewed interest, just like in skin health, it's happening also in scalp health and hair health. And it's related to people's interest in wanting to grow their hair longer, especially thinking about the fact that some of these restrictions may apply for months on end. So just really, really interesting that this is coming into focus. And again, natural ingredients is something that is a uniting factor, both on the skin side and on the hair side. That's really fascinating. Okay, next sector is food. I've got two more sectors, by the way, for those of you who are curious. So food, really interesting. With food, obviously it's the most obvious connection because immune health is front and center right now in the midst of COVID. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, we are doing a deep dive into food tomorrow on a separate webinar. But that is, it is a client-only webinar, but if you are interested, feel free to reach out to me personally and I'd be happy to give you access. Now, the focus on food is interesting because it comes out of immunity, but the most interesting part is this increased realization amongst the consumer that to improve immunity, I can't just, eat my yogurt in the morning and assume it solves the problem, or I can't just pop a pill in the morning and assume it solves the problem. I actually need to improve my overall nutrition. That's a really fascinating thing because we've all known this, scientifically speaking, but the consumer hasn't really shown interest in this. The solution has always been, quick fixes. Now suddenly there's an interest in wanting to be more nutritionally whole, wanting to reduce one's nutritional deficiencies, and in particular, the focus is on vitamin C, B12, and D as the key areas where consumers feel they're most commonly deficient. But again, the focus is on improving overall nutrition by eating better. We're seeing consumers also connect their immunity, obviously, to gut health, but also connect nutrition to gut health, where obviously people are realizing that good nutrition enables good gut health. And obviously for good gut health, people are focused on fermented foods and ingredients. But again, another interesting thing here is even though in the short term, people are buying supplements in order to survive, the long-term shifts we're seeing is actually moving away from supplements and this realization that I actually need to eat better. In order to eat better, I should find ways to integrate fermented foods and fermented ingredients into my diet. And obviously, again, the opportunity here is for companies that make it easier for consumers to integrate some of these fermented foods and ingredients into their diets, with, again, the overall focus on just better nutrition. And of course, again, the connection is immunity, nutrition, and gut health, all three interconnected in the mind of the consumer. And then take that one step further, they're also connecting that in particular to a fiber and antioxidant rich diet, which is low in sugar and also low in dairy. Another interesting thing, we've seen this, attack on dairy continue for a while, but this is worsening the situation because we're seeing people talk about everything from heart health to gut health, all of which link to not an elimination of dairy, just a reduction of dairy consumption, especially on healthful occasions. I think this is really, really fascinating. If you want us to dive more into that, reach out to me. I'll try to give you access into tomorrow's webinar because there's more to say on this. Obviously, there's a lot going on there, but really, really interesting, this doubling down on this reduction in dairy consumption. But this holistic knowledge that fiber, antioxidant rich diet with a nutritionally rich diet as being necessary for good immune health, really fascinating that it's starting to come into focus. And then I come on to the last sector, which is apparel. And apparel, again, an interesting one, obviously a really tough sector. There's obviously a lot of struggle here. The one area that we are seeing the situation drive from a consumer perspective is a greater attention on sustainable fashion. I don't think this is a surprise. We're seeing sustainability slowly get peppered into different sectors, with people realizing, for example, we saw that with baby and with diapers and other baby products. We're seeing that here with apparel. It has made people, one reality is that the pandemic itself has suddenly allowed people to access products that they normally would not buy because of, massive sales and clearance sales and things like that. So A, it's just enabled access to certain products. B, it's also enabling a deeper conversation around wanting to buy quality clothing that allows people to shorten the supply chain. Really, really critical here, really interesting. For those of you who attended the previous webinar, you'll remember we talked about this in terms of the consumer's interest in mass production sourcing. The shortening of the supply chain here extends not just to food, but also to apparel here, where people believe that if they're buying better quality products, they're more likely to shorten the supply chain. The product will last longer. It's going to be better for the environment. So they'll buy less, but they'll spend the same amount in the end. So some of those conversations, I mean, we've known about these kinds of trends, but this is really bringing that trend into greater focus. And, you know, one has to think about what kind of impact this will have on the mass market and on what we would call, quote unquote, fast fashion. Again, I'm not talking about the economics here. My focus entirely is on the cultural impact. And on the cultural side, what we can see is this renewed interest in the mid-tier in particular, you know, as an opportunity to shorten the supply chain from what one has previously bought, but as also an opportunity to access certain innovations that they might not get in the mass market. For example, there's a renewed interest in hypoallergenic and antibacterial fabric. These are two things that are coming up. And by the way, the connection to fabric also connects into linen. So the same conversation about, you know, jeans and shirts also extends into, you know, bedding. So it's just interesting here. And again, there's an interest in innovative fabrics that potentially minimize bacteria. You know, again, could be hypoallergenic. Again, that goes with this overall thread of just minimizing allergies and improving respiratory health in general. And then the last part I'll say is there is also more and more focus. We're seeing people share articles like these. Especially in the month of April, we saw this a renewed focus on the treatment of employees and overseas workers. We'll have to wait and see what kind of impact this will continue to have. But there is a fair bit of negativity on the apparel industry in the midst of this pandemic on the treatment of employees, both locally and overseas. So it's just interesting. We'll have to wait and see what this is doing. But again, if you link back to the broader shifts around sustainability and the shift around wanting a shorter supply chain, negativity around this is worsening the situation, especially for fast fashion labels. So it's just an interesting cultural shift to think about. Again, I'm not talking about the economics around the supply chain. I'm talking about culturally how the consumer is thinking about this and how their beliefs are affecting their beliefs about what to buy in the future. And that's it. And then I'll end with a shameless plug, but it's not, you know, it's not that shameless, to be honest, because, you know, we wrote this book without knowing, obviously, that we're going to be in the midst of a pandemic right when this book launched. And I think it's been fascinating because a lot of people have written to us after reading the book because it gives them perspective. It allows them to not get stuck in the short-term rut. And that's our goal with all of this. Our goal is to help people get outside of the short-term thinking. It's very easy to look at, you know, short-term changes and go, this is what the future will be. No, it won't be, because in the short term, we're being forced to act in a way. What we're really interested in understanding is when you're forced to act in a way, what are the parts of your belief systems that will undergo an evolution? Not change, nothing will change overnight. What will undergo an evolution, and how will that evolution affect certain categories? And hopefully we've given you a good sense of that today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ujwal. And thank you very much for the patience for everybody that has shared some of the questions. I've just been organizing them to try and basically kind of help build off of the questions as